They say a man knows trouble the moment it steps into his house. But Ethan Cole woke to it already breathing beside him, cold as winter stone under his own blanket. And for one long second, he didn't move, didn't breathe, just listened to the wind pressing against the cabin walls like it wanted in on whatever this was. Then his hand slid slow across the mattress, searching for the familiar weight of his revolver, until his fingers brushed against skin that shouldn't have been there, skin colder than the night outside. And that's when his eyes opened and found her, a woman he had never seen before, lying inches from his chest, dark hair tangled with frost, her shoulders barely rising with each shallow breath. And everything in him went still, not from fear, not yet, but from the kind of confusion that makes a man question if he's still dreaming. Except dreams don't leave your fingers wet. And when he pulled his hand back into the faint gray light leaking through the window, there it was, dark and real against his skin. And suddenly the quiet of the room changed shape. It wasn't quiet anymore. It was waiting for him to understand what had just crossed into his life without knocking. Ethan pushed himself up on one elbow, careful, slow, the way a man moves when he doesn't know if the next second will turn ugly, his eyes scanning her for anything that looked like a weapon, a threat, a reason to regret not waking sooner. But there was nothing like that. No knife, no gun, no sign of force. Just the rise and fall of her breathing and the faint tremble that ran through her like she was holding onto the last bit of warmth she could find. The blanket pulled tight around her shoulders as if it were the only thing keeping her tethered to this world. He should have pushed her away right then, should have dragged her out into the cold and shut the door on whatever story she carried with her. That's what a smart man would do out here, alone, where trouble didn't come in small pieces. It came all at once and took everything with it. But something in the way she didn't react, didn't reach, didn't even seem aware of him, held him in place, and then she shifted. Just enough for the blanket to slip. And that's when he saw it clearer, the source of that warmth on his hand, the dark stain spreading slow into the fabric beneath her, not fresh enough to shine, not old enough to ignore, and his jaw tightened without him realizing it. Because whatever this was, it wasn't an accident. People didn't end up like this by chance. Not out here. Not in weather that could freeze a man solid in less than an hour. She made a sound then, barely a whisper, more breath, then voice, and her lips moved like she was trying to form words that didn't have the strength to exist. Ethan leaned just enough to catch it, not close, not trusting, just enough to hear the edge of it. Cold, she murmured, and it wasn't a plea, wasn't a request, just a statement, like the cold had driven her farther than fear ever could. And for a moment, just a moment, Ethan felt something shift under his ribs, something he hadn't felt in years, not since before the land took more than it gave, before silence became easier than company. He sat there, watching her, listening to the wind, feeling the weight of a choice that hadn't even been spoken yet. And then his eyes caught something else, something small in her hand, half hidden by the blanket, her fingers curled tight around it like it mattered more than the blood she was losing. He hesitated before reaching for it. Not out of fear, but out of the understanding that whatever he touched next might change everything that came. After, still, he moved, slow and deliberate, easing her fingers open just enough to see what she held. And the moment it came into view, Ethan stopped cold, not because it was dangerous, but because it wasn't supposed to be there, not with her, not in his bed, a sheriff's badge, silver dulled by dirt, and something darker, bent just enough to show it hadn't been handed over willingly. And for the first time since he woke, Ethan Cole understood that this wasn't about a stranger seeking warmth. This was about a line that had already been crossed somewhere out in the dark, and whatever had chased her here might not be far behind. As if the thought itself had weight, the world outside answered, faint at first, then clearer, the distant rhythm of hooves cutting through frozen ground, steady, unhurried, certain, and Ethan's head turned toward the door as the sound carried closer. Not a storm, not the wind, but men. And in that moment, with the badge in one hand and the cold breath of a stranger in his bed, he realized the night wasn't over. It had just begun. The hoofbeats did not rush, and that was the first thing Ethan noticed. They came steady, measured, like men who already believed they would find what they were looking for. And that kind of certainty weighed heavier than any storm. He stood there for a second longer than he should have, the broken badge still in his hand, the cold air from the window slipping across the floorboards, and behind him, the woman shifted again, a small movement, but enough to remind him she was still here, still breathing, still part of whatever was about to unfold. Ethan set the badge down on the rough wooden table beside the bed, not tossing it, not hiding it, just placing it like it deserved a space of its own. Then he moved, quiet and deliberate, crossing the cabin in 3 slow steps, each one measured against the rhythm outside. The riders were closer now, maybe 50 yards, maybe less. The kind of distance where voices carried if they wanted them to. But these men were not speaking, not yet, and that silence said more than words ever could. Ethan reached the door, but did not open it, his hand resting against the wood. Feeling the faint vibration of the approaching horses through the frame, he glanced once over his shoulder, not at her face, not at her eyes, but at the rise and fall of the blanket, still there, still steady enough. Then his gaze dropped to the stains spreading across his bed, a quiet reminder that whatever choice he made next would not stay inside this room. It would follow him, settle into the walls, into the land, into the kind of memory a man carries without ever speaking about it. The horses stopped just outside, close enough now that he could hear leather creak, hear boots shift in stirrups, and then a voice came, calm, controlled, not loud but not needing to be, the kind of voice that expected to be answered. "You awake in there?" The man called, and Ethan let a breath out through his nose, slow, steady, before answering. Been awake long enough. His voice carried through the wood, flat, giving nothing away. There was a pause, just long enough to measure him, and then another voice joined, lighter, almost friendly. "We are looking for someone. Came this way not long ago. Thought maybe she might have passed through." Ethan did not move, did not look back again. His eyes stayed on the door, on the thin line of light. Beneath it, "You see anyone?" the first voice asked, and there it was, the moment, simple in words, heavy in everything else. Ethan's mind did not race. It did not need to. It moved slow, deliberate, like a man walking a fence line he had walked 100 times before. He thought about the badge on the table, bent, out of place. He thought about the blood on his sheets, not hers alone anymore, because now it belonged to him too. He thought about the way she had said one word, not begging, not pleading, just stating a fact, cold, and for a second, just a second, he wondered what it took for someone to choose a stranger's bed over the open land. What kind of line had to be crossed before that became the safer choice? Outside, one of the horses stamped against the frozen ground, impatient, or maybe just tired, and the man spoke again, this time a little sharper. "We do not have time to waste." Ethan finally shifted, just enough to let his hand fall away from the door, his shoulders, settling into a stillness that felt like decision, not hesitation. And when he spoke, his voice came out even, steady, the kind of tone that did not invite questions, did not see anyone. The silence that followed stretched longer this time, thicker, like the air itself was waiting to see if he would add more, explain, justify. But he did not. He stood there, saying nothing else, offering nothing else, and after a moment, the lighter voice returned, softer now, almost thoughtful. "Cold night. To be out alone." Ethan did not answer that, because there was nothing to answer. The cold did not care who you were. It did not ask questions. It just took what it could. The men outside shifted again, a quiet exchange of movement. More than words. And then the first voice spoke one last time. "If you see her, you let us know." It was not a request, but it was not a threat either, just something placed between them, like a marker on a map. Ethan nodded once even though they could not see it, then answered, "I will." And the words left his mouth without weight, without promise, just sound. The horses turned, hooves crunching against frost, the rhythm changing as they pulled away, not fast, not slow, just gone the same way. They came, certain, and Ethan stood there until the sound faded into nothing, until the wind filled the space again, until the cabin felt like his own place once more. Only then did he turn back toward the bed, toward the woman who had not moved during any of it. As if she trusted the silence more than anything he could have said, he walked back slow, each step heavier than before, and when he reached the table, his eyes found the badge again, catching the faint light from the window, dull, silver, bent but not broken, and for the first time, Ethan did not see it as something that belonged to someone else. He saw it as something that had crossed into his life the same way she had, uninvited, unavoidable. And when he looked at her again, really looked this time, not as a problem, not as a stranger, but as someone who had chosen his door out of every door she could have found, he realized something quiet and certain had already taken root, something that did not need words, because out here, a man did not decide who he was by what he said, but by what he did when no one else was looking. Morning did not arrive all at once. It crept in slow through the cracks in the cabin walls, turning the dark into something softer, something that made everything look less certain than it had in the night. And Ethan Cole stood by the small stove, watching the faint glow of embers come back to life as he fed them a single piece of dry wood, not rushing, not making more noise than needed, because the quiet in the room had changed. It was no longer empty. It carried weight now, the kind that settles into a place after something important has already happened. He glanced over his shoulder. The bed still held her, though the tremble in her body had eased, replaced by a stillness that felt deeper, more dangerous in its own way, because stillness like that could mean strength returning, or it could mean the opposite, and Ethan had seen both before. He poured a small measure of water into a dented tin cup and set it near the heat, letting the warmth build slow, the way you do when you are not sure how much a body can take. Not after a night like that. His eyes moved again, drawn back to the table where the broken badge lay, catching the early light in a dull reflection. It looked different now, less like an object, more like a question that had not been asked out loud yet, and he found himself wondering whose name had once been etched into it, whose authority it had carried before it ended up in the hand of a woman who had chosen silence over explanation. Behind him, there was a faint shift, a sound so small it might have been the wind if he had not been listening for it. Ethan did not turn right away. He let the moment settle, gave her the space to wake on her own terms, because there are things you do not rush, not out here, not when trust is as thin as the frost on the window. Then her voice came, rough, quiet, but steady enough to hold its shape. "You told them no," she said, and Ethan finally looked back, not surprised that she knew, because people like her, people who carried something heavier than fear, they always knew. He nodded once, simple. "They asked," I answered. He replied, and she pushed herself up just enough to lean against the rough headboard, the blanket still wrapped around her shoulders, her eyes finding his, not with gratitude, not with suspicion, but with something harder to name, something that measured him the same way he had measured her the night before. "That badge," she said after a moment, her gaze shifting toward the table. "It does not belong to me." Ethan followed her eyes, then stepped closer to the table, picking it up again, turning it once in his hand, feeling the bend in the metal, the way it had been forced out of shape. "Figured that much," he said, his voice low, not pressing, not demanding more than she was willing to give. She watched him for a second longer, then let out a slow breath, like someone deciding how much truth the morning could carry. "He dropped it," she said, and the words were simple, but they carried something under them, something that did not need to be spoken to be understood. Ethan did not ask who, did not ask why, because he had already seen enough to know that answers like that came with their own weight, and a man had to be ready to carry them before he went looking. Instead, he set the badge back down, not where it had been before, but closer to the edge of the table, within reach, as if it belonged to the space between them now, not just to one side or the other. The cup near the stove gave a soft sound as the water inside shifted, and Ethan moved to retrieve it, bringing it over to her, without stepping too close, without closing the distance more than necessary. He held it out, steady, and after a brief pause, she took it, her fingers brushing the metal first, testing the warmth, then wrapping around it with care, like it was something that could break if handled wrong. She lifted it to her lips, taking a small sip, then another, each one measured, controlled, and for the first time since he had woken, Ethan saw something change in her posture. Not weakness, not exactly, but a release of tension, a quiet acceptance that she had made it through the night, at least this one. He leaned back against the wall, arms loose at his sides, giving her the space to drink, to breathe, to exist without being watched too closely. But his mind did not settle. It moved back to the riders, to the certainty in their voices, to the way they had not sounded surprised when he said no, as if they had expected resistance. Expected someone like him to stand in the middle of something that did not belong to him. And that thought sat heavy, because out here, nothing stayed separate for long. Not trouble, not choices, not consequences. They will come back, she said quietly, lowering the cup, and Ethan met her eyes again. There was no fear in her voice, only fact, the same way she had spoken the night before, and he nodded, once. Most things do, he replied, and for a moment, neither of them spoke, the silence settling between them, not empty, not uncomfortable, just present, like the land outside, like the wind that never really stopped. And then she did something small that shifted the weight of the room again. She set the cup down beside the badge, not handing it back, not keeping it close, just placing it there, next to the thing that had brought her into his life. And when she looked up at him again, there was something different in her eyes, not trust, not yet, but recognition, the kind that comes when two people understand they are standing on the same ground. Even if they came from different directions, and Ethan Cole, who had spent years keeping his world small, quiet, untouched, realized without saying it out loud that the line he had crossed the moment he answered that door had not been behind him. It was still in front of him, waiting for what he would do next. The fire had settled into a steady glow by the time the sun cleared the horizon, casting long pale lines across the floorboards, and Ethan Cole stood just inside the doorway, watching the land the way a man does when he expects it to answer him back. The frost still clung to the ground in thin silver sheets, unbroken except for the tracks left behind by the riders. 3 sets, clear, deliberate, leading away, but not far enough to feel gone. He studied them for a moment, measuring distance, without moving, the way you do when you are deciding whether trouble has passed or only stepped aside. Behind him, the cabin remained quiet, not empty, not anymore, and that difference followed him even as he stepped out onto the porch. The cold air hit sharper than before, but he did not pull his coat tighter, did not shift his stance. He let it sit where it was, a reminder that the world outside had not changed just because something inside him had. He crouched slightly, running his eyes along the edges of the tracks, noting the depth, the spacing, the slight drag on one side where a horse had favored a leg, small things, details that most men would ignore. But out here, details were the only language the land spoke clearly, and these tracks said one thing without needing words. The riders had not been in a hurry, not last night, not when they left, which meant they believed they would return. Ethan straightened slowly, his gaze drifting toward the far ridge where the land dipped and rose again, the kind of place men used when they did not want to be seen coming back the same way they left. He stayed there a moment longer than needed, letting the wind move past him, carrying nothing but cold and distance. Then he turned back toward the cabin, because whatever decision was coming next, it was not out there, it was inside. He stepped in and closed the door behind him with a quiet finality, not locking it, not yet, just shutting out the space he had already measured. The woman was no longer leaning against the headboard. She had moved, slow enough not to disturb anything, now sitting at the edge of the bed, her feet barely touching the floor, the blanket still wrapped around her shoulders, but looser now, less like armor, more like something she had chosen to keep. Her eyes lifted as he entered, not startled, not guarded, just aware, and that awareness carried its own kind of strength. They circled back. Ethan said, not as a question, not as a warning, just placing the thought in the room. She nodded once, as if she had expected nothing less. They always do, she replied, her voice steadier now, the rough edge from the night worn down by warmth and time. Ethan walked past her without crowding the space, moving to the table where the badge still lay beside the cup. Untouched since she set it there, he picked it up again, turning it once more between his fingers, then set it back down in the exact same place, not claiming it, not giving it back, just leaving it where it had meaning. You can stay until the sun is higher, he said after a moment, his tone even, not offering more than he could hold. After that, it gets harder to pretend you were never here. She watched him, studying not just the words, but the space around them, the limits he had drawn without saying them outright, and for a second, something like understanding passed through her expression, not agreement, not yet, but recognition of the line he was walking. She shifted slightly, testing her weight, her breath catching for just a moment before settling again, and Ethan noticed, not in the way a man notices weakness, but in the way he measures what can be carried and what cannot. "I will not bring trouble to your door," she said, and there was no promise in it, no certainty. Just a statement shaped by what she knew and what she did not control. Ethan leaned back against the wall again, his arms folding loosely across his chest. "You already did," he replied, not harsh, not accusing, just honest, and the words hung there between them, not cutting, not pushing, just existing the way truth does when no one tries to soften it. She held his gaze for a moment longer, then looked down at the badge, her fingers brushing the edge of the table but not reaching for it, as if touching it would pull something back that she was not ready to face again. "That man," she said quietly. "He wore it like it made him right." Ethan did not answer immediately, because there are things a man has to let settle before he puts words to them. And when he did speak, his voice came low, measured. Sometimes it just makes people believe they are. The silence that followed was not empty. It carried the weight of two different worlds meeting in the same small space, not clashing, not agreeing, just existing side by side for the first time. Outside, the wind shifted, pressing lightly against the walls again, as if reminding them both that time was moving whether they chose to acknowledge it or not. Ethan pushed off from the wall, stepping toward the small shelf near the stove, pulling down a worn piece of cloth and a tin of salve, not looking at her as he set them on the table beside the badge. "You will need that before you leave," he said, simple, direct, and she looked at the items, then back at him, something unreadable in her eyes, not gratitude, not suspicion, something quieter, something that did not need a name. And for a brief moment, the room felt balanced, like two people standing on opposite sides of a line neither one had drawn, but both had chosen not to cross. And Ethan Cole understood then that whatever came next would not be decided by what had already happened, but by what they chose to do with the time that was still left between now and when the riders returned. Time did not move fast inside the cabin. It stretched, slow and deliberate, like the land outside deciding whether to hold its breath or let it go. And Ethan Cole felt that stretch in everything, in the way the fire settled lower, in the way the light shifted across the table, in the way the woman across from him now sat straighter than before, not because she was stronger, but because she had decided to be. And that kind of decision carried more weight than any wound. He watched her take the cloth he had set out, her hands steady enough now to work, careful, controlled, as if every movement had been measured long before she ever stepped through his door. She did not rush, did not show pain, but it was there in the way her breath paused between motions, in the way her shoulders tightened just slightly when she pressed the cloth against her side. Ethan did not step closer, did not offer help, not because he did not see it, but because he understood that some things a person has to do alone, especially when they have spent too long surviving without anyone to lean on. The cabin stayed quiet except for the small sounds of her work, the soft rustle of fabric, the faint scrape of wood as she shifted her weight, and beneath it all, the low hum of the fire holding steady. Outside, the wind had eased, but not disappeared. It never did out here. It just changed shape. And Ethan knew that meant the land was settling into something else, something that often came before movement, before men who thought the quiet meant they were alone. He pushed himself off the wall again and moved to the window, not to hide, not to watch in fear, but to confirm what he already felt building. His eyes traced the horizon, the ridge line, the low dip where the riders would likely return, and there it was, not clear, not yet, but enough, a faint shift in the distance, something that did not belong to the stillness of the morning. He did not call it out right away, did not break the space inside the cabin with what was still forming outside. Instead, he turned back toward her, because whatever was coming, it was not just his anymore. She finished securing the cloth, her hands slowing, then stopping, and for a moment she sat there, her gaze lowered, not in weakness, but in thought, as if she was measuring something unseen, weighing what she had against what she would need. Then she reached for the badge, her fingers brushing its edge, before lifting it. And this time she did not hesitate. She held it in her hand, looking at it not as an object, but as something that carried a past she had already stepped away from. "If they find me," she said quietly, not looking up, "they will not ask again." Ethan stood where he was, the distance between them unchanged, but the meaning of it shifting, They already did not, he replied, and the truth of it settled between them without resistance. She nodded once, small, acknowledging not just his words, but the choice he had already made, and for the first time, something like respect crossed her face, not given freely, not easily, but earned in the quiet way things are out here. She set the badge back down, not where it had been before, but closer to him now. A small movement, easy to miss, but not meaningless. Ethan noticed, not reacting, not reaching for it, just letting it remain where she placed it. Because some things speak louder when they are left untouched. The shift outside grew clearer then, the faint line of movement turning into something more defined, and Ethan finally spoke, his voice low, steady. They are coming back. She looked up immediately, not startled, not afraid, just ready, and that readiness carried a different kind of weight, the kind that comes from knowing the next moment will ask more than the last. She pushed herself to stand, slower this time, but with purpose, her feet finding the floor, her balance holding, not perfect, but enough. Ethan stepped aside slightly, giving her space, not guiding, not directing, just making room for her to choose where she stood. She moved toward the center of the cabin, not toward the door, not toward the window, but somewhere in between, a place where she could see both without committing to either, and Ethan understood that, because he had lived that same line for years, standing where the inside and outside met, never fully belonging to one or the other. The sound of hooves grew louder, clearer, no longer distant, no longer uncertain, and this time there was no pause in them, no measured approach, just a steady return. Like men who had already decided how this would end, Ethan walked to the table, his hand hovering near the badge for a brief second before dropping back to his side, not taking it, not moving it, leaving it exactly where it was, because whatever it meant now, it was no longer his to carry alone. The cabin seemed smaller as the sound closed in, not from fear, but from focus, every detail sharper, every breath more deliberate, and Ethan Cole, who had spent years keeping his life contained within the edges of his land, realized that the moment he had answered that door, the edges had already shifted, and now, with the riders returning and the woman standing in the space between leaving and staying, the only thing left to decide was not whether trouble had found him, but whether he would stand still when it did. The second time the horses stopped, they did not wait at a distance. They came right up to the cabin, close enough that the sound of leather and breath filled the space between the walls, and Ethan Cole stood where he was, not reaching for anything, not stepping back, just letting the moment arrive the way it had decided to. The woman did not move toward the door, did not hide. She stayed where she had chosen to stand, her shoulders squared not in defiance, but in acceptance, like someone who had already measured the cost of being seen. And outside, a boot hit the ground, slow, deliberate, followed by another. And then a hand struck the door, not hard, not soft, just enough to say they were done asking from a distance. Open it. The voice came, the same one from before, calm but thinner now, like patience had already been spent somewhere else. Ethan did not answer right away. He let the silence stretch, not to challenge, not to provoke, but because he understood that once the door opened, whatever line had been holding this together would disappear, and some lines, once gone, do not come back the same. You said you would tell us, the second voice added, lighter, but carrying something sharper underneath. Ethan's eyes moved once across the room, taking in the badge on the table, the cloth, the cup, the woman standing just off to the side, and then he stepped forward, one step, then another, until he stood in front of the door, his hand resting against the wood the same way it had the night before, feeling the presence on the other side without needing to see it. I said I would, he replied, his voice steady, and there was a pause, a small shift outside, as if the men were adjusting to something they had not expected. Then open it, the first voice said again, and this time there was no space left between the words. Ethan drew in a slow breath, not deep, not dramatic, just enough to settle the weight in his chest. And then he opened the door, not wide, not inviting, just enough to meet what stood outside. 3 men, the same as before, their coats dusted with frost, their eyes already searching past him, measuring the space behind him without asking permission. The one in front held himself straight, not aggressive, not relaxed, just certain, and his gaze settled on Ethan with a kind of quiet expectation. "Mind if we take a look?" he said. Though the way he stood suggested the answer would not change what came next, Ethan did not move aside, did not block them either. He simply stood where he was, filling the doorway with nothing but his presence, and for a moment, that was enough to slow them, just enough to remind them that this place belonged to someone, not just the land. "You already asked," Ethan said, and the words were simple, but they carried the same weight as before, not louder, not stronger, just consistent. The second man shifted slightly, his eyes narrowing just a fraction. "And you already answered," he replied, and the air between them tightened, not with anger, but with something quieter, something that builds. When two sides realize they are no longer speaking the same language, behind Ethan, the woman did not speak, did not step forward, but her presence filled the space in a different way now, not hidden, not exposed, just there, and somehow that made everything sharper, clearer. The first man's gaze flickered past Ethan again, just for a second, and Ethan saw it. That moment of recognition, not of her face, not fully, but enough to know he was no longer guessing. "You sure about that?" the man asked, and this time the question was not about words, it was about choice. Ethan did not look back, did not confirm, did not deny. He just held the man's gaze, steady, unblinking. "I am," he said, and the silence that followed was heavier than before, not because of what had been said, but because of what had not. The three men stood there, measuring him, weighing the cost of stepping forward against the cost of stepping away, and for a long moment, nothing moved, not the wind, not the horses, not even the light shifting across the ground. It all seemed to wait on that line. And then the first man gave a small nod, not agreement, not approval, just acknowledgement, like a man marking a place in his mind. "All right," he said quietly, stepping back just enough to break the tension without shattering it. "But we will be back." Ethan did not respond to that, because some things do not need an answer. They exist whether you speak to them or not. The men turned, mounting their horses without hurry, without looking back again, and the sound of hooves carried off once more, fading into the distance the same way it had before, but different now, because this time, nothing about it felt uncertain. Ethan stood in the doorway until the sound disappeared, until the land returned to its usual quiet, and only then did he close the door again, slower this time, more deliberate, as if sealing something in place. When he turned back, the woman had not moved, her eyes still on him, and for the first time, there was something there that had not been before, not just recognition, not just understanding, but something closer to trust, quiet, fragile, but real. And Ethan Cole, who had spent years believing that staying out of other people's stories was the only way to keep his own intact, realized that he had already stepped into one that would not let him stand at the edge anymore. The cabin did not feel the same after the door closed, not quieter, not louder, just different, like something invisible had shifted its place and refused to go back, and Ethan Cole stood there a moment longer than needed, his hand still resting on the wood, as if he could feel the riders through it even after they were gone. Then he let it drop, slow, deliberate, turning back into the room where nothing had moved, and yet everything had changed. She was still standing where he left her, but the way she held herself had shifted, not just steady now, but grounded, like the ground beneath her feet belonged to her again. And that kind of change does not come from warmth alone. It comes from knowing you are no longer alone in what is coming next. Ethan walked past her without brushing against her, keeping that same careful distance that had defined every moment between them. And yet the space felt smaller now, not because they had moved closer, but because the line between them had. "They will not wait long this time," she said, her voice calm, not warning, not afraid, just certain. And Ethan nodded once, because he had seen the same thing in the way those men looked at him, the way they did not argue, did not push, did not need to. Men like that did not rush, they returned, and when they did not ask twice. He moved to the window again, not searching now, just confirming what the land was already telling him. The ridge was empty, but that did not mean anything, not anymore, and he knew it. "You have somewhere to go?" he asked after a moment, not turning, not pressing, just placing the question where it could be answered or left alone. She did not respond right away, and when she did, Her voice carried something heavier than before, not uncertainty, but distance. "There is always somewhere," she said, and that was not an answer. Not really. It was a truth shaped like one. Ethan let it sit, did not challenge it, because he understood that kind of answer, understood what it meant to move without a place to return to choose direction over destination. He turned back slowly, his eyes finding the table again, the badge still resting where she had placed it, closer to him now than before, and for a brief second, he considered picking it up, not to keep it, not to give it back, but to understand it, to feel what kind of story had bent it out of shape. But his hand did not move, because some things are not meant to be understood all at once. Some things reveal themselves only after you decide what you are willing to do with them. She stepped closer to the table then, not rushing, not hesitating, just moving with purpose, and when she reached it, she picked up the badge again, this time holding it differently, not like something she carried, but like something she was ready to leave behind. She looked at it for a moment, then placed it back down, right in the center of the table, between them, not closer to him, not closer to her, but exactly in the middle, and that small movement carried more weight than anything she had said. Ethan saw it, understood it without needing words. This was no longer just her story or his. It had become something shared, something neither of them could step away from without leaving a piece of themselves behind. "You could have sent me out," she said quietly, her eyes lifting to meet his. When they asked, Ethan met her gaze without flinching. "I could have," he replied, and the truth of it hung there, simple, unhidden. She studied him for a second longer, then gave the smallest nod, not gratitude, not approval, just acknowledgement of a choice that had already been made and could not be undone. Outside, the wind shifted again, carrying with it a faint change in the air, not sound, not yet, but something that felt like it would become sound soon enough. Ethan moved away from the window, stepping toward the door, not to open it, not yet, but to stand closer to the place where the next moment would arrive. He rested his hand lightly against the frame, not holding it, just feeling its presence. And for the first time since the night before, he spoke without waiting. "When they come back," he said, his voice low, steady, "they will not ask." She did not look away this time, did not lower her eyes or shift her stance. She held his gaze, firm, grounded. "I know," she said, and there was no fear in it, no hesitation, just understanding, the kind that comes when a person has already seen what is waiting ahead. The room fell quiet again, but not the same quiet as before. This one carried decision in it, unspoken but solid, like the land itself when the frost settles deep enough to hold weight. Ethan's eyes moved once more to the badge on the table, then back to her, and in that moment, something settled inside him, not loud, not dramatic, just a quiet alignment of thought and action, the kind that does not ask for permission. It simply becomes, and without saying it out loud, without making it a promise or a declaration, Ethan Cole understood that whatever came next, he would not step aside. Not this time, not for this, because some lines, once crossed, do not lead back to where you started, they lead forward, whether you are ready or not. The sound came before the riders did, not loud, not sudden, but steady, the kind of sound that does not belong to chance, it belonged to intent. And Ethan Cole heard it long before it reached the cabin, felt it in the way the air shifted just slightly, in the way the quiet outside stopped being empty and started being occupied. He did not move right away, did not reach for anything, because there was nothing left to prepare. Whatever was coming had already decided its path, and the only thing left was how it would be met. Behind him, she had not stepped back, had not looked for a place to hide. She remained where she was, near the center of the room, her posture steady, her eyes no longer searching but fixed, as if she had already accepted that this moment was not something to avoid. It was something to stand through. Ethan's hand rested lightly against the doorframe, not gripping, not bracing, just present, the same way he had been through every step of this, present without retreat. The hoofbeats grew closer, more defined, until they settled just outside, closer than before, closer than any man came without expecting an answer. There was no knock this time, no voice calling out, just the quiet shift of weight outside, the kind of silence that asks without asking. And Ethan understood it, understood that this time, The question was not what he had seen, but what he would do now. He opened the door before they could ask, not wide, not inviting. Just enough to meet them again on the same ground. The three men stood there, but something had changed in the way they held themselves, not their stance, not their expressions, but their certainty had sharpened, narrowed, like a line drawn tighter than before. The one in front looked at Ethan, not searching now, not measuring, just seeing. She is here, he said, not a question, not a guess, just a statement placed between them. Ethan did not answer right away. He let the words settle, let the space around them carry the weight they deserved. Then he stepped forward just enough to fill the doorway again, the same way he had before, the same quiet barrier that was not made of force, but of presence. You said you would tell us, the second man added, his tone lighter, but the edge beneath it clearer now. Ethan's eyes did not move from the man in front, did not flicker back into the cabin, did not confirm or deny with anything but the stillness in his stance. I told you what I saw, he replied, and this time, the words carried something different, not just truth, but choice, and that difference did not go unnoticed. The man in front took a slow step closer, not threatening, not rushed, just closing the space enough to make the line between them visible. And now, he said quietly, you see more. Ethan did not step back, did not shift his weight. He held where he stood, the wood of the cabin at his back, the open land behind them, and in that moment, there was no distance left between the two sides, just a single line drawn in silence. Behind him, the woman did not speak, but her presence pressed forward in a different way now, not hidden, not exposed, just undeniable, and somehow that made everything clearer. The first man's gaze flickered once, just enough, and Ethan saw it again. The recognition that had started the moment he opened the door. Step aside, the man said, not loud, not forceful, just certain, like the outcome had already been decided somewhere else. Ethan let the words sit there, did not answer them immediately, because there are moments when a man has to hear what is being asked before he chooses how to respond, not just with words, but with who he is willing to be when the answer is given. His eyes moved once, briefly, not toward her, not toward the badge, but toward the space between them, that thin invisible line that had been there since the night before, and in that single glance, everything that had led to this moment settled into place, the cold, the blood, the badge, the silence, the choice, all of it. And when he looked back at the man in front of him, there was no hesitation left. No, he said, simple, steady, and the word did not rise, did not fall. It just existed, solid and unyielding. And for the first time since they had arrived, the stillness broke, not with movement, not with sound, but with something deeper, something that shifted beneath the surface of the moment. The second man let out a slow breath, almost a quiet laugh, not amused, not surprised, just acknowledging what had already become clear. You know what that means, he said, and Ethan nodded once. Not because he agreed, not because he accepted, but because he understood. And understanding is not the same as stepping aside. The man in front studied him for a second longer, then gave a small nod of his own, the kind that marks a decision without needing to speak it out loud. All right, he said quietly, stepping back just enough to let the space breathe again. Then we will see how long you hold that. The three of them turned without another word, mounting their horses with the same steady ease they had shown before, and as they rode off, the sound of hooves did not fade the same way it had the first time. It lingered, carried farther by something heavier than distance, and Ethan stood there in the doorway until the last trace of it disappeared, until the land returned to its quiet once more, and only then did he close the door again, slower than before, more deliberate, as if sealing something that could not be undone. When he turned back, the woman was still there, but the space between them was no longer the same. It had shifted, not closer, not farther, but deeper, and in that depth, something had taken hold that neither of them had asked for, but both now carried, and Ethan Cole understood that whatever came next would not be about stopping what was coming. It would be about standing in it without turning away. The quiet that followed did not bring relief. It brought clarity, the kind that settles in after a man has already made the choice he cannot take back. And Ethan Cole stood with his back against the closed door, feeling the last echo of hoofbeats fade into the distance, not listening for them anymore. But knowing they had not gone far, men like that did not leave. They repositioned, they waited, and waiting out here was not patience. It was preparation. He let his hand fall from the wood slowly, turning back into the room where the fire had burned lower, the light thinner now, stretched across the floor like something running out of time. She had not moved far, but she was no longer standing in the center. She had shifted closer to the table, closer to the badge, as if the space between her and that piece of metal had finally closed. Her fingers rested near it, not touching, just close enough to feel its presence. And when her eyes met his, there was no question left in them, no uncertainty, only the quiet understanding that whatever came next would not be avoided. They will not come again like before, she said, her voice even, and Ethan nodded once, because he knew that already, had felt it in the way they left, in the way the last man looked at him, not angry, not frustrated, but resolved, and resolution out here carried a different weight than anger ever could. It did not burn, it settled, it stayed. Ethan stepped away from the door, moving toward the table, his gaze dropping to the badge again. That small piece of silver that had somehow become the center of everything without ever asking to be. He reached for it this time, not hesitating, his fingers closing around its bent edge, feeling the shape of it, the way it had been forced out of what it was meant to be, and for a moment, he just held it there, not lifting it, not turning it, just holding it, as if it could tell him something if he stayed still long enough. She watched him, not interrupting, not explaining, because some things do not need words when they have already been understood. You carry it like it belongs to you now, she said, quietly, and Ethan let out a slow breath, his thumb brushing once along the worn surface. It does not, he replied, but it came here, and that was the truth of it, simple, unadorned, and enough. She gave a small nod, not agreeing, not disagreeing, just accepting that truth for what it was. The fire gave a faint crack as the last piece of wood settled deeper into the coals, and the room seemed to tighten around that sound, like the moment itself was drawing in, preparing to release something that had been building since the night before. Ethan set the badge back down, not in the center this time, not closer to either of them, but just off to the side, as if making space for something else to take its place. He moved then, crossing the room toward the far wall where his coat hung, pulling it down without hurry, shrugging it over his shoulders, not as preparation for leaving, but as acknowledgement that staying would no longer be still. She watched him, her posture shifting again, not bracing, not retreating, but aligning with the same understanding that the line they stood on had already been crossed, and there was no stepping back to where it had been before. You do not have to stand here, she said after a moment, her voice quieter now, not weaker, but carrying something that had not been there before, not distance, not caution, but consideration. And Ethan paused, his hand resting briefly against the back of the chair, his eyes lifting to meet hers. I already did, he said, and there was nothing else in it. No explanation, no justification, just the fact of it. And for a second, something shifted in her expression, something that looked like it might have been relief, but not the kind that comes from safety, the kind that comes from no longer carrying something alone. Outside, the wind changed again, not stronger, not louder, but different, carrying with it a faint tremor of movement that had not yet reached the ear, but would soon, and Ethan felt it the same way he had before, not as a sound, but as a certainty. He stepped toward the door again, not opening it, not yet, just placing himself near the place where the next moment would arrive. She did not move to follow, did not move to leave. She remained where she was, but the space between them no longer felt like distance. It felt like connection, like 2 points held in place by something neither of them had named, and the cabin, small as it was, seemed to hold that connection like it mattered, like it had been waiting for something like this to happen. Ethan's gaze moved once more across the room, the fire, the table, the badge, the place where she had first stood when he woke, and then back to her. And in that moment, there was no longer a question of what side of this he stood on. There was only the quiet certainty that he would not step away from it, no matter how it ended, because some choices are not made in the moment they are spoken. They are made long before, in the way a man lives, in the lines he draws and the ones he refuses to cross. And now, with the air outside beginning to shift once more, with something approaching that would not knock or ask or wait. Ethan Cole understood that the next time the door opened, it would not be to answer a question, it would be to face what came with it. And this time, there would be no space left for anything except the truth of who he had chosen to be. It came in the air before it came in sound, a pressure that settled low and steady, like the land itself was bracing for something it could not turn away, and Ethan Cole felt it in his chest before he heard the first distant shift of hooves again. Not 3 this time, not measured the same, something heavier, something that carried weight beyond the riders he had already faced. He did not move from where he stood by the door, did not reach for the handle, because he understood now that this moment was not about reacting. It was about holding the line he had already drawn without knowing it. Behind him, she remained still, but not passive, not waiting. Her posture carried the same quiet readiness that had defined her since the night she stepped into his life. And in that stillness, there was no fear, only awareness, the kind that comes when a person has already walked through what others are only beginning to face. The sound grew clearer, more defined, until it was no longer a question of if, but how many, and Ethan's eyes shifted once toward the window, not to count, not to measure, but to confirm what his instincts had already told him. This was not a return, this was an arrival, the kind that does not come back for answers, it comes to settle something. He let out a slow breath, his hand finally moving to the door, resting there without opening it, feeling the faint vibration of the approaching riders through the wood, each step outside pressing closer into the space inside. And for a moment, the entire world seemed to narrow to that single point. The door, the line between what was his and what was coming to take it. This will not stop with them, she said quietly, her voice steady, not warning, not afraid, just stating what she already knew. Ethan did not turn, did not need to, because he had already reached the same conclusion. It already did not. He replied, and the words settled between them. Without resistance, not heavy, not light, just true. The riders slowed as they reached the cabin, not stopping all at once, but circling slightly, positioning, the way men do when they are no longer testing the ground, but claiming it. The sound of hooves moved around the walls, not hurried, not cautious, just present, and that presence filled the space like something that could not be ignored. Ethan closed his eyes for a brief second, not in doubt, not in hesitation, but in recognition. This was the moment where a man finds out if the choice he made in silence will hold when the world answers back. And when he opened them again, there was no shift left in him, no uncertainty, only the quiet certainty that had been building since the night before. He opened the door before they could call out, not waiting, not reacting, just stepping into what had already arrived. The scene outside had changed, more men now, not crowding, not pressing forward, but spread just enough to make the space feel smaller, tighter, like the land itself had been narrowed to this one place. The man he had spoken to before sat at the front, his posture unchanged, but his eyes sharper, more certain, and when he looked at Ethan, there was no question left in them. "We gave you the chance," he said, his voice calm, almost quiet, and that quiet carried more weight than anything louder ever could. Ethan stepped just outside the threshold, not far, not leaving the door behind him, but enough to stand fully in the open, the cold air pressing against him like a reminder of where he stood. "You did," he answered, simple, and the truth of it did not need more. The man studied him for a moment, not angry, not impatient, just measuring the space between what had been offered and what had been refused. "Then this is on you," he said, and again, it was not a threat, not raised, not sharpened, just placed where it belonged. Ethan nodded once, not agreeing, not accepting, just acknowledging that the line between them had already been drawn, and nothing said now would move it. The wind shifted again, carrying dust lightly across the ground, and for a moment, everything seemed to still, not because it had ended, but because it had reached its point. The place where nothing more needed to be said. Behind Ethan, the cabin stood quiet, the fire low, the badge still resting on the table where it had been left, and in that quiet, something else took shape, something not seen, not spoken, but felt. The weight of a choice carried through to its end, and Ethan Cole stood there, not as a man caught in someone else's story, but as someone who had stepped into it and refused to step back out. Not because he had to, but because he chose to, and as the men before him held their ground, and the air between them tightened into something that could not be undone, Ethan understood that whatever came next would not be decided by force or fear, but by the one thing that had brought this moment into existence in the first place, a choice made in silence, held without regret, and carried forward without turning away. Nothing moved for a long moment. Not the men on horseback, not the wind brushing across the open land, not even the dust that had been lifted into the air. It all seemed to pause at the edge of something unseen, as if the land itself was waiting to see which way this would turn, and Ethan Cole stood there in that stillness, not shifting his weight, not reaching for anything, just holding the space he had stepped into, and the man in front of him watched the same way, not with anger, not with urgency, but with a kind of quiet patience that comes from believing the outcome is already decided. "You do not understand what you are standing in," the man said after a while, his voice low, steady, and the words did not push forward, they settled, like something placed carefully between them. Ethan did not answer right away. Not because he did not have words, but because he understood that some things are not answered with speech, they are answered with presence, with the way a man holds his ground when everything around him suggests he should step aside. And so he remained where he was, the open doorway behind him, the land stretching out in front, and in that position, there was no space left for misunderstanding. The line had already been drawn. The man's gaze lingered on him, searching not for weakness, but for doubt, and finding none, he gave a small nod, not of agreement, but of recognition, as if something had shifted in his understanding of the man before him. "She carries something that does not belong to her," he continued, his tone unchanged, "and it will not stop with her." Ethan's eyes did not leave his, but something inside him settled deeper, not reacting, not resisting, just absorbing the weight of what was being said, because he had already felt that truth, had already seen it in the badge, in the way it did not belong anywhere it had been placed. "Maybe it does not belong to you either," Ethan said finally, his voice calm, not challenging, not sharp, just present, and the words hung there in the open air, not loud, but impossible to ignore. The second man shifted slightly in his saddle, the faint creak of leather breaking the stillness for a brief moment. But the one in front did not move, did not react outwardly, though something in his eyes changed, not anger, not offense, but something quieter, something that acknowledged the truth had more than one side. "You are not wrong," he said after a pause, and that admission did not weaken him. It did not soften the moment. It only made it clearer. This was not about right or wrong. It was about who would carry what came next. The wind moved again, brushing lightly across the ground, stirring the dust in small shifting patterns, and Ethan became aware of the weight behind him. Not just the cabin, not just the woman inside, but the choice he had already made, the one that had brought him to this point without ever needing to be spoken out loud. "Then why come back?" Ethan asked, not accusing, not questioning, just placing the thought where it could be answered, and the man in front of him looked past him for a brief second, not into the cabin, not searching, just acknowledging the presence that had changed everything. "Because some things have to be seen through," he said, and there was no threat in it, no promise, just a statement of what would happen regardless of who stood where. And in that moment, something shifted again, not in the men, not in Ethan, but in the space between them. The tension that had been building since the night before did not break. It did not rise. It settled, like a line that had finally found its place. And Ethan understood then that this was not about forcing an outcome. It was about holding a position, holding it long enough for something else to emerge, something beyond the reach of what any of them could control. Behind him, there was a faint sound, the smallest shift of movement inside the cabin, not sudden, not rushed, but intentional. And though Ethan did not turn, did not look back, he felt it, the presence of her, stepping closer to the line he was holding, not to replace him, not to step past him, but to stand with him. And that changed something, not in the men outside, but in the way the moment held together. The man in front saw it too, not with his eyes, but with the same awareness that had guided him this far. And for the first time since they had arrived, he let out a slow breath, not of frustration, not of defeat, but of recognition. "This is not how it usually goes," he said quietly, and Ethan gave the smallest nod, because nothing about this had followed the way things usually went. Not the night she came, not the choice he made, not the way they now stood facing something neither side had fully planned for. The man shifted slightly in his saddle, then looked at Ethan one last time, not measuring, not questioning, just seeing him for what he had become in this moment. "Then we will leave it here," he said, and the words did not carry finality, not entirely, but they carried enough to change the shape of what was happening. The others behind him did not argue, did not question. They followed his lead the same way they had before, not because they had been told, but because they understood. The horses turned, slow, deliberate, and as they began to ride away, the sound of hooves did not carry the same weight it had before. It was still there, still present, but something in it had shifted, something had been set down, even if only for now. Ethan remained where he was until they were gone from sight, until the land returned to its open quiet once more. And only then did he step back into the doorway, not closing it right away, just standing there, letting the moment settle into something he could carry forward, because he knew this was not an ending, not completely, but it was something else, something quieter, something that did not need to be spoken to be understood. And as he finally turned back into the cabin, the line he had held did not disappear. It remained, not outside, not inside, but somewhere in between, exactly where it had always been waiting. The door remained open longer than it needed to, not because Ethan Cole had forgotten to close it, but because something in him understood that shutting it too quickly would erase the weight of what had just passed, and some moments needed to linger before they could be carried. The wind moved gently across the threshold, no longer pressing, no longer testing, just passing through like it always had before any of this began. And yet it felt different now, like it had witnessed something, and chosen not to disturb it. Ethan stood there, just inside, his hand resting lightly against the frame, his eyes fixed on the horizon where the riders had disappeared, not watching for their return, not expecting it, but acknowledging the space they had left behind, a space that felt larger than before, not because the land had changed, but because the line within it had. Behind him, she had stepped closer, not enough to stand beside him, not enough to take his place, but enough to share the same direction, the same quiet understanding of what had just happened. And for a moment, neither of them spoke, because there are moments that lose their meaning the second you try to explain them. Ethan finally stepped back, closing the door with a slow, deliberate motion, not sealing anything away, just marking the shift from outside to inside once more. The cabin felt warmer now, not from the fire, which had burned low, but from something less visible, something that had settled into the space between them. She moved past him without hesitation, not brushing against him, but close enough that he could feel the presence of her passing. And that was new, not the distance they had kept before, not the careful space that had defined their every movement. This was something quieter, something that did not need to be measured. She stopped at the table, her hand reaching for the badge, lifting it once more, but this time there was no weight in the movement, no hesitation, no question. She looked at it briefly, then turned slightly, extending it toward him, not as an offering, not as a burden, just as something that no longer needed to remain between them. Ethan looked at it in her hand, then at her, and for a moment, he did not move, not because he was unsure, but because he understood that this was not about the badge anymore. It was about what it had represented, and whether it still held that meaning. He reached out slowly, taking it from her, his fingers brushing hers just for a second, not intentional, not avoided, just part of the moment. And when he held it again, it felt different, not heavier, not lighter, just quieter, like whatever it had carried had already been set down somewhere else. He walked to the small shelf near the wall, placing the badge there, not hidden, not displayed, just set aside. And when he turned back, she was watching him, her expression unreadable, not because there was nothing there, but because there was no longer a need to show it. "It does not matter anymore," she said softly, and Ethan nodded once, because he understood that now, not as an idea, but as something lived through, something carried and then released. The fire gave one last small crack as the wood settled into ash, and the room grew quieter still, not empty, not waiting, just at rest, the kind of rest that comes after something has been decided without force, without struggle, just through the steady holding of a line that did not break. She moved toward the door then, not rushing, not hesitating, just walking with the same quiet certainty she had shown since the beginning, and Ethan watched her, not stopping her, not asking where she would go, because some things do not need to be said, and some people do not need to be held to remain present. She paused at the threshold, her hand resting lightly against the door, the same way as had earlier, and for a moment, she looked out at the land, the same land that had brought her here and would now take her somewhere else. Then she turned her head slightly, just enough to look back at him, not fully, not directly, just enough. "You did not ask my name," she said, and there was no accusation in it, no expectation, just a quiet observation. Ethan met her gaze, steady, and after a brief pause, he replied, "You did not offer it." And the words settled between them with a kind of balance that had not been there before. She held his gaze for a second longer, then gave the faintest nod, not agreement, not disagreement, just acknowledgement. And then she stepped outside, the cold air taking her shape and carrying it into the open space beyond the cabin. Ethan did not follow, did not move to the door. He remained where he was, because some departures are not meant to be watched, they are meant to be understood. The door stayed open for a moment longer, the wind brushing through once more, then settling. And when he finally stepped forward to close it, there was no urgency in the motion, no need to hold on to what had already passed, because what mattered was not that she had come, or that she had gone, but that something had changed in the space she left behind, something that would remain long after the tracks outside had disappeared, and Ethan Cole stood there in the quiet of his cabin, not alone in the way he had been before, but not accompanied either, just different, in a way that did not need to be named to be real. The cabin returned to stillness the way a pond returns to glass after a stone has sunk, slow, almost careful, as if the air itself did not want to disturb what had settled there, and Ethan Cole stood where he had closed the door, his hand still resting lightly against the wood, not holding it shut, just feeling the quiet on the other side. The wind had eased again, carrying nothing now but distance, and for a long moment, he did not move, because there was nothing left to react to, nothing left to answer, only something to understand. He turned at last, stepping back into the room that looked the same as it had before, the table, the chair, the low fire now reduced to faint embers, and yet none of it held the same weight. The space felt different, not fuller, not emptier, just changed in a way that did not ask for explanation. His eyes drifted to the shelf where he had placed the badge, the dull silver catching a thin line of light, and he walked toward it without hurry, picking it up. Once more, turning it slowly between his fingers, not searching for meaning now, not trying to read a story from its shape, just acknowledging that it had passed through his hands and would remain, not as proof of anything, but as a reminder of a moment that had not needed proof to be real. He set it back down in the same place, not adjusting it, not hiding it, just letting it rest where it had been left, and then he moved to the table, his hand brushing lightly across the surface where the cup had sat, where the cloth had been folded, small things, ordinary things, but they carried the quiet echo of something that had passed through them, something that had not asked permission to exist, but had been given space anyway. He stepped toward the window, looking out across the land that stretched as it always had, wide, open, unchanged, and yet he knew better than to believe that nothing had shifted, because the land does not change when something happens, the man standing on it does. The tracks outside had already begun to fade, the frost loosening under the growing light, softening the edges until they would soon be gone. And that was the way of things out here. What passed did not stay visible for long, but it did not disappear either. It settled into memory, into the quiet places a man carries without speaking about them. He rested his hand against the frame of the window, the wood cool beneath his fingers, and for a moment, he allowed himself to stand in that stillness without needing to fill it, without needing to decide what came next. Because for the first time in a long while, there was no immediate next, no task, no problem waiting to be solved, just the simple fact of what had already been done. Behind him, the cabin held its silence, not empty, not waiting, just present, and Ethan understood that this place, this small space he had built to keep the world at a distance, had not been broken by what had happened. It had been opened, not in a way that invited everything in, but in a way that allowed something through. Something that did not need to stay to matter. He stepped away from the window then, moving toward the door once more, not to open it fully, but to pull it just enough to let the outside air move through. A quiet exchange, nothing forced, nothing held back. The breeze slipped in, light, carrying no trace of what had passed, only the scent of the land itself, dry, steady, unchanged, and he stood there, feeling it move across the room, across his face, across the space where she had stood, where the line between them had once been, and he realized that the line was still there, not dividing, not separating, but connecting, a place where two paths had crossed without needing to merge, a place that would remain even after both had moved on. He let the door rest open for a moment longer, then closed it again, not sealing anything away, just returning it to what it was, and when he turned back into the room, there was no sense of loss, no sense of gain, only a quiet recognition that something had been set right, not by force, not by words, but by the simple act of not stepping aside when it would have been easier to do so. He moved to the chair by the table, sitting down slowly, his hands resting loosely in front of him, not holding anything, not needing to, and for a long moment, he did nothing at all, just sat in the quiet, in the space that had been changed without being claimed, and in that stillness, Ethan Cole understood something he had not put into words before, something that did not need to be spoken to be true, that out here, where the land stretches wide and the rules are often written by those who speak the loudest, justice does not always arrive with noise or force. Sometimes it comes in silence, in a single decision held steady long enough for the world to adjust around it, and sometimes that is enough.